Let's talk a little bit about the basics of photography. All cameras are similar at their heart. A lens with aperture, shutter, and a plane where film or digital media is recorded. Here are some of the controls on a DSLR camera. The term DSLR refers to digital single lens reflex and means a professional or amateur camera with an internal mirror and one which you can take on and off the lens. Although you can customize the settings to take photographs in manual, shutter, or aperture priority, on auto setting an SLR acts just like a big fancy point and shoot. Point and shoot cameras are designed for amateurs and are compact and foolproof. The lenses or flashes cannot be removed from these cameras. With just a little bit of photographic knowledge, it is possible to use them in a more manual and less automatic mode. The goal of the point and shoot is usually to keep everything in focus, so it is quite difficult to use them for creative effects. Two of the chief controls on any camera are aperture and shutter speed. Aperture controls how much light is let into the lens. With aperture, the smaller the number, the larger the opening. Shutter speed controls how much time the shutter is open and is measured in seconds or parts of seconds. Different combinations of these two tools create different looks in a photograph and can be used for creative results. The other control that photographers have is called ISO, which measures the camera's sensitivity to light. On digital cameras, it is changeable with each exposure, whereas on film cameras, the speed of your film would dictate your ISO. Lower ISO numbers create more pleasing photographs as noise is increased with higher speeds. Aperture controls critical focus of the frame. By deciding how much light you are letting in during an exposure, you can also affect how much is in focus in an image. In photography, this term is called depth of field, and it can be shallow, great, or somewhere in the middle. How much depth of field you have is dependent on the aperture you choose. The image on the left was taken wide open at f2.8 and has very little in focus. In contrast, the one on the right was taken closed down at f16 and is sharp all over. One of the advantages a DSLR camera has over phones and point and shoots is the ability to have control over these settings. Here's an image with shallow depth of field. An image taken with a wide aperture and shallow depth of field often has good bokeh, which is the aesthetic quality of the blur in an out-of-focus area of an image. Lenses are often sought out with the goal of getting the most pleasing bokeh. The type of image Ansel Adams would have created with his view camera has great depth of field. He was a member of a group called F64, which used a very tiny aperture to let light in and resulted in extremely sharp images. This image has great depth of field, which is accentuated by a wide-angle lens. Shutter speed controls motion, blur, and implies motion. It is the second main tool that photographers use both technically and creatively. The shutter speed controls how long the exposure is. On the left, we have an example of a fast shutter speed, which serves to freeze the action of the water. Sports photographers rely on fast shutter speeds to capture the action. On the right is an example of a slow shutter speed, which causes the water in the image to look soft and flowing. Slow shutter speeds are used to add blur, motion, and feeling to an image. This is a photographic technique called a pan. For a pan, you use a slower shutter speed, which is roughly equivalent to 1 over the miles per hour that your subject is traveling. You then move with your subject while taking the picture. Although it looks fancy, the technique is actually quite easy and fun to experiment with. There are many different types of lenses. Normal lenses, like a 50mm, capture just what our eyes sees normally. A wide-angle lens will capture more than our normal view and can distort the subject if not used carefully. In comparison to a fixed lens with one focal length, zoom lenses offer a number of lenses together in one convenient package. Most point-and-shoot cameras come with a zoom lens. Most DSLR owners screw a skylight or UV filter in the front of their lenses to reduce haze and to protect the expensive glass of the lens. A $30 filter is much easier to replace than a $500 lens. Here's an example of the same scene as taken with 3 different focal lengths, but without moving the camera position. Note that the feeling of each of the images is slightly different according to the lens that was used. Sports photographers, as well as nature photographers, use telephoto or long lenses to get close to the action. These lenses allow for shallow depth of field and blur out the background, making sure that the subject stands out from an often distracting situation. Now let's talk a little bit about image manipulation and the plus sides and downsides that we have with that in photography. Artists often challenge us as viewers to ask what is and isn't real and true. Artist Sandy Skoglund creates surreal tableaux and then photographs the effects without ever using the computer. Whether you can believe it or not, these images by Jerry Uelsman were created in a darkroom for art purposes. He uses multiple enlargers to painstakingly create these surreal masterpieces. Uelsman's wife, artist Maggie Taylor, uses flatbed scanners as cameras and Adobe Photoshop software as a virtual darkroom to create her painterly images. Annie Leibovitz shot a wonderful campaign called the Disney Dream Portraits that combined great images with some Photoshop magic. Behind the scenes with Leibovitz photographing athlete Michael Phelps, complete with a merman tail. It helps to have good quality images to start out with, something all of you should remember when you're doing your digital projects. Commercial photographer Joel Grimes is known for his gritty look in his composite portraits. The look of this technique is called HDR toning, or high dynamic range, and the technique results in more intense light and dark areas of an image. This image is also a combination of several images put together. Here is a very striking example of digital manipulation for advertising work by Kong Nguyen in a fashion campaign for Louboutin. Of course, what is acceptable in art, advertising, or commercial work differs greatly to what is ethical in photojournalism. The ease of digital manipulation has created multiple instances of ethical violations in editorial photography. Although this existed in the days of film and darkroom, it is much easier to do using today's technology. The National Press Photographers Association is very clear on where it stands with ethical violations. From the NPPA Code of Ethics, it reads, "Editing should maintain the integrity of the photographic image's content and context. Do not manipulate images in any way that can mislead viewers or misrepresent subjects." Here is a clear case of digital manipulation. The original photograph that John Philo took in 1970 of the Kent State University massacre is shown on the left, and on the right we see that Time magazine has removed the pole out of the student's head. The pole, granted, was in a very unfortunate position, but it is still a violation of ethics to remove the content of an editorial photograph. Here we have three fine examples of digital manipulation. Images are often manipulated on magazine covers to achieve maximum impact and attract buyers, as if they were advertisements. On the left, we have National Geographic, who in February of 1992 decided to move the Egyptian pyramids so that they would be accommodated on a vertical cover. In the center, we have Oprah's head, which was placed on Anne Margaret's body in 1989, and on the far right, Texas Monthly, in 1992, they used a computer to place the head of the then governor Ann Richards on the body of a model riding a Harley-Davidson motorcycle. In June of 1994, Newsweek ran this straight image of O.J. Simpson's mugshot, whereas Time decided to create a photo illustration to illustrate the same story. This is an interesting example. So 20-year veteran LA Times photographer Brian Walsky was fired over a doctored photo from the Gulf War in 2003. In order to do this, he digitally combined the two images, where he took the soldier from the left image and combined it with the image of the man on the right. The lighting conditions were the same, so the manipulation was very easy to pull off. He said he had tried to improve the composition by combining two images, citing a complete breakdown in judgment caused in part by the stress of his assignment. Here is the resulting composite image. Granted, it is more pleasing, and it was initially published. It's a stronger image, but never actually happened. Once we start not telling the truth in photographs, the public ceases to believe that these events were real and actually happened. The future of photojournalism could lie with the iPhone. The idea of the phone as a serious camera is making traction, even in traditional journalistic outlets. In March of 2013, the New York Times took a controversial step and ran this photo by Nick Lahan on the front page, taken with an iPhone and processed using Instagram. As even more evidence of the changing nature of photojournalism, this photo from the conflict in Libya was taken for Time magazine by photographer Michael Christopher Brown in 2012. He chose to use the iPhone for this assignment and subsequent ones because it was about the freedom a phone provides, the ease of use, and the fact that it is not seen as a camera. The phone and my experiences over the past couple years have shaped the way I look at photography, as I felt less like a photographer and more like a citizen. We'll end on this pure digital image by digital artist John Paul Caponegro. No violation of ethics, just pure artistic freedom.